What's up, good people of the world? I have to be slightly quiet because it is 12:45 a.m. So, I promised you we would get to writing, and we will. We'll definitely get into some counterpoint today. But before we actually start writing the subject and its counter-subject and the structure of the fugue and start brainstorming ideas, I do want to kind of quickly run through some contrapuntal techniques that I've kind of discovered over the years, both composing counterpoint as well as studying the fugues of Bach and other contrapuntal composers such as Hindemith, that might be useful and that we may very well use when in the process of writing fugue, and they're just little counterpoint tips and tricks, so to speak, and I think it'd be better for me to kind of go through and show them. I'm going to show them and demonstrate them preliminarily, so that when we get into actually writing the fugue, we can talk about the structure and the context, as opposed to getting, me getting derailed and going into a big long rabbit trail in the process of writing the fugue. So let's go ahead and get started. A couple of things that are really helpful and one-to-one counterpoint are understanding these little building blocks, these sort of like Lego building blocks of counterpoint that work very well. You don't have to use them all the time, but they work very well. So the first thing we're going to demonstrate is some tips and tricks in one-to-one counterpoint, meaning that they both have the same rhythmic value and two-part counterpoint. This is also known as first species counterpoint in a lot of contrapuntal pedagogies. So as you know from the previous videos in this series, when dealing with two-part counterpoint, and even with dealing with three-part counterpoint, you want to have mostly imperfect consonances, okay? Because they just sound good. They resonate with the overtone series. They give you a sense of the harmony. They have a sort of warmth to them that's very nice, right? And now that we have, three-part counterpoint when writing a fugue, you are going to have a perfect consonance, and usually that's going to be sweetened by an imperfect consonant. So you very often will have sonorities such as this, right, where we have, basically we're just spelling out a triad, right? We have a perfect fifth, right, and then we have this nice third, right, and the third is, it's nice that the third is on top because it is a imperfect consonance with both the middle voice and the low voice, right? It's a major sixth with the alto, and it is a major third with the bass, right? But we want to have a balance of perfect consonances and imperfect consonances, in the sense that if we have a fifth in the lower voice, we immediately afterward want to try and change it by oblique or contrary motion, or similar motion, to a third or sixth as often as possible. You're just going to get a better sound that way for a bunch of reasons, which I may go into in some video at some point, but way too long for this. There are a lot of reasons why parallel fifths and parallel octaves and even direct octaves are not allowed, and there are very specific reasons, and some of them are relevant to our writing today, and some of them aren't. Just because I think it would be interesting for you all listening, I'm just going to go ahead and explain one of those, because I think you'll find it interesting. I'm not going to explain all of them, but just this one particular one, just to give you a taste of some of the interesting, archaic reasons behind some of these seemingly pedantic and esoteric rules. One of the classic rules in Baroque counterpoint and medieval Renaissance counterpoint is you cannot approach a direct octave pretty much from anywhere. You can approach a direct fifth if one of the voices is moving by step, but you can't approach a direct octave. And this is interesting, because if you have something like, a 5-1 cadence, right? Let's say, that's a G. So we have T-do in the soprano and sol-do in the bass, right? Very, very common thing, right? T-do. T-do is a great melody line. The leading tone leads right up to do. And sorry, I know I'm using solfege. It's an easy way to communicate scale degrees rather than saying scale degrees. You're saying the specific notes of the key that we're in. So I would highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with solfege. It's been super helpful for me, learning it, and it's only 7 scale degrees with some slight alterations. But so scale degree 7 going to scale degree 1, right? T-do, right? T-do. Has a very nice lead to it. And of course, if we want to have a root position 5 chord going to a root position 1 chord, we have to have sol-do, right? Or in this case, G going to C, scale degree 5 going to scale degree 1. this creates direct octaves, right? So what's the idea of direct motion, right? I can't remember whether or not I explained this in a previous video. Direct motion is where you arrive at a sonority by similar motion, which means that there aren't parallel octaves. If I had 2 octaves in a row, they would be parallel octaves. But if I arrive at an octave, right, from left to right, if I arrive at an octave in similar motion, it's considered to be direct octaves. And why was this not okay, right? We have independence of the voices, right? We're going from a third to an octave. We have 2 different intervals, right? So what's the problem? We're not losing independence here. And the reason, interestingly, is because back in the olden days, and when I mean like old days, like in, Renaissance music, it was very common for vocalists to add ornamentation, right? So if you had a leap, yada, they might add something like yada, right? And the interesting thing is, if you were to add ornamentation, scale-wise ornamentation, to get from this G to the C, right? Something like this, you end up with parallel octaves, right, at the very end. And so this is very, very interesting to me. But this is actually the reason that Johann Joseph Fuchs, in his Gradus ad Parnassum, in his counterpoint book, this is the very specific reason why he explains that direct perfect intervals are not allowed, is because of the fact that singers would often add ornamentation, and they sort of wanted to safeguard that ornamentation from creating parallels that they did not intend in the music. Now, of course, if you're writing out your music and you're not intending your singers to add any notes that aren't there, because with plain chant, there were genres of music in which improvisation, contrapuntal improvisation, was actually a common thing that trained singers did. So nowadays we don't have to worry about that problem, right? And in the Baroque period, this was a rule that was quickly done away with because of the harmonic motion 5-to-1, and because you now have the idea of tonal harmony, root position triads. Because remember, back in medieval times, it was just intervallic structures as opposed to harmonic structures. So the idea that arriving at a perfect consonance by direct motion or by similar motion, we'll say, so, arriving at a direct fifth or a direct octave or a direct unison, the idea that that's bad kind of fell out of favor. Some textbooks, like Leitz's textbook, The Complete Musician, they say that, okay, you can use direct octaves, but you should only do it when you need to. So if the soprano is moving by step, which really all that means is that don't use direct octaves unless it's in a 5-1 cadence. But for our purposes today, in my mind, there's no, I've researched all the reasons why rules like this exist, and I can confidently say that, nowadays, even if you're writing Baroque-style counterpoint, there's no reason to avoid direct octaves or direct fifths. So that's something to be aware of. But anyway, let's get back to one-to-one counterpoint. So one of the things that is really common when dealing with, in order to try and create one-to-one counterpoint that has as many imperfect consonances as possible, or rather only imperfect consonances, one thing to be aware of is that when you have a third, you can arrive at a sixth if one voice moves by step and the other voice moves by third, right? So I can arrive at a sixth like that, the octave right? That's nice. I can also arrive at a sixth like this, right? And the nice thing about this is that this leap can be, or leap, it's really a skip, it's not a huge leap, but it can be mitigated, because remember, in this Baroque style, especially if you have fast 16th note lines, right, and that's another thing, I don't want to derail the conversation again, but this is really important. If you listen to Bach, there's a lot of, there's a lot of quick 16th note lines, and when you, it is almost impossible. I know it's a lot of instrumental music, and string players can pretty much play anything and, leap easily. And there is a difference between instrumental counterpoint and vocal counterpoint. But that being said, the faster your contrapuntal lines are, the more you want to try and follow these rules melodically of like, if you leap, you want to come back in the opposite direction, the faster the counterpoint is. So one thing, and the only reason I bring this up is because it happens all the time in Bach's counterpoint. You very often have structures like this, right, where you have a third, which splits out by contrary motion to a sixth, right? And this motion in the upper voice is just stepwise, which is nice. And this motion in the lower voice, right, we have a leap, which is then mitigated, right? And you can keep this going. You don't want to have too many parallel sixths or thirds in a row because you lose independence. So you can keep this going, and it creates a really, really nice, first off with the lines, right? The lines are really nice, because every time you have a leap, it's only a leap of a third, right? And you immediately come back by step, easy to sing, right? You can create nice sequences. And the lower verse, right? Really nice. And you only have thirds and sixths, so it's a very sweet, pure, kind of warm tonal sound. And you have almost complete independence, right? Because we only have two parallels in a row successively. It's parallel imperfect consonances, and we have contrary motion, right? And it's complete contrary motion because they're moving by different intervals, right? Right? You see stuff like that in Bach's music all the time. That's the only reason I bring it up. And constantly when I'm writing counterpoint, and you're kind of these Lego building blocks, and if you're kind of burdened by all the possibilities of counterpoint, it's useful to kind of try these little building blocks out and see whether or not they work. Okay. Going again from a sixth to a third, if we start dealing with 1 to 2 counterpoint, right, we can fill in this third, right? We can go something like this, right, which is really nice, right? And because this is functioning as a passing tone, this is in fact invertible counterpoint, right? We think of this fifth as a consonance, and we don't need to treat it specially. But remember, when we're writing a fugue, it's very important that all of our counterpoint is invertible. So this fifth is going to invert to a fourth, and fourths, at least in two-part counterpoint in the Baroque period, need to be treated as dissonances, right? So if we take this and we invert it, I'm trying to figure out the easiest way to do this. I'll just do this. Right? If we invert it, the fifth now becomes a fourth, and now it is treated properly. It's treated like it's treated as a passing tone, which resolves by step. Okay, so that's an important thing to realize, right? And then again, if we're going from this sort of this kind of that kind of sequential motion, the nice thing about that is because the leaps are alternating, we can fill in the passing tones with the opposite voice, and we get a lot of independence, right? So I can fill in this third, I can fill in this third, I can fill in this third, right? And you end up with a structure that it is invertible counterpoint. All the dissonances are treated properly. On a macro basis, you have alternating sixths and thirds. You have complete independent, and you also have complete rhythmic independence, where there's eighth notes in the upper voice, there's a quarter, and vice versa, right? So this is like contrapuntally, utterly optimal, and it sounds nice. And you can keep on going, right? And you can even turn it into, something. You could turn it into a modulating sequence where you are moving in the circle of fifths. Another thing that's very, very common that happens in not only in Bach fugues, but in the more contrapuntal passages of Mozart's music, Haydn string quartets, Brahms symphonies, just these types of little structures that just work perfectly. You're not necessarily bound by them as a composer, but they work great and they sound great, and there's nothing wrong with pulling them out. Okay. Another thing that's useful is sometimes you can use chromaticism, especially if the chromatic tone that you are borrowing from another mode, so to speak, creates a secondary dominant. In other words, like if I had, C major, just, tonally, if I had C major going to D minor, and actually these parallel fourths are okay in Baroque music, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. But in any case, the point that I'm trying to get at here is if we have a 1 chord and then it goes to a 2 chord, right? We can interject the dominant of the 2 chord, which we borrow from the key of 2, right? So we're basically borrowing from the key of D minor, right? And in the D minor, we raise the leading tone C sharp to get this nice 5-1 motion. So I get something like this, right? Right? And so we can interject this leading tone here. And it's very important to realize that even in Baroque music, even when you only have 2 parts, you still are implying harmony, and everything has to make sense harmonically. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to get at here is if we have something like this, right? This structure works perfectly well. We have a 5th, right? Which then contracts into a 3rd, right? Very nice, both voices moving by step. If we wanted to turn this into 2 against 1 counterpoint, there's a more effective tone to be used, right? So if I were to do something like this, right? That's okay, right? But it sounds weird, right? And I want to unpack a little bit why this particular structure sounds weird. If we use this, that sounds much better, right? Do you hear how logical that sounds? And there are a couple of reasons. One, when we arrive at the sonority, it sounds like a D minor chord, right? We're missing the 5th, which does exist in the overtone series. But anytime you just play a 3rd, it sounds like the bottom half of a triad, okay? And 2-part counterpoint, right? Unless you contextually are very careful to imply otherwise. That's basically what the implication is, right? So that means that this structure makes sense. We end up with this tritone here, right? This tritone contracting into the D minor chord. And so what is this implying? Well, it's really just implying 5, 7 to 1, right? And as you probably remember from music theory, if you've studied, 18th century part writing, the tritone that exists in the 5-7 chord needs to be resolved in the proper way. The leading tone wants to resolve up, right? And the 7th resolves down, right? Fa goes to mi or me, and T goes to do. So you end up with this structure, right? Same goes for diminished 7th chords, but we'll get that later. But so that makes sense, right? We get this tritone, right? It's basically just, the dissonant notes in a dominant 7th chord, very common in 2-part counterpoint, and the notes resolve properly, right? The 7th of the dominant 7th chord goes down, and the leading tone resolves up to do. Even though this leading tone is a borrowed leading tone, it's borrowed from the key of D minor, it doesn't actually exist in C major, right? That's the whole point of a secondary dominant. You may want to look into those if you're unfamiliar with that concept. Secondary dominants. Lates calls them applied dominants. But in any case, so if we try and make the case for this, right, this doesn't make so much sense, right? Why does it make so much sense? Well, okay, one reason is that this sonority right here, the only time you're really going to have a tritone in Baroque music is when it is a part of the dominant 7th chord. So if we think of this tritone and we think, okay, what is this tritone implying, right? We think of, okay, well, if we want to try and make a tritone, if we wanted to make a dominant 7th chord out of F sharp and C, we go with this, right? D dominant 7, which happens to be the dominant, of course, of G, right? So we have 5 of 5, basically, right? So in that case, F sharp is the leading tone and resolves up, and C is the 7th and resolves down. So we don't get that in this case, right? We get opposite resolution. The C goes up to D, right? And the F sharp goes down to F, right? So the first thing is we end up on a sonority which is actually a retrogression, because a retrogression is where you have a predominant after a dominant, right? Because, if you remember about tonal harmony, basically, and this also goes back to Schenkerian analysis, in tonal music, you have a selection of predominants, 4, 6, 2, whatever, and then you have dominant 5, and then you have 1, right? So when you go from a dominant, which wants to go to the tonic, back to a predominant, so if you go from in the key of C major, if you go from the 5 chord back to the 4 chord, from the 5 chord, in this case back to the 2 chord, that's a retrogression. We have that in pop music all the time, but it doesn't have a sense of, tonal, it's not logical voice leading, right? So that's a problem, right? We're going from basically what wants to lead a dominant that wants to lead to our 5 chord, but instead we're going back to the 2 chord. So it doesn't make sense harmonically, and it doesn't make sense in terms of voice leading. These tendency tones don't even need to resolve where they want to. And this last part is a little bit complicated, so don't worry about it if you don't understand it. But even if we were to respell this, what am I trying to get at here? Even if we were to respell, yeah, that's how I want to respell. Even if we were to respell this sonority as a diminished 5th instead of an augmented 4th, right, it still would resolve. Like, for example, if we were to try to figure out what dominant 7th this tritone was, it happens to be A flat dominant 7th, right? Because remember how you spell notes, especially how you spell tritones, is very important. A flat dominant 7, which wants to lead to D flat. So even if you were to make a case for, oh, okay, well, tritones can contract or expand depending upon which dominant 7th chord they imply, and that gets into the whole idea of tritone substitutions. Even in that case, this should be a D flat, not a D natural, right? If you wanted to use the tritone substitution inversion of a 5 chord. If that last part doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. But for those of you that are familiar with those things, I think that can be helpful. So it's important to realize that, you don't want to oversimplify concepts such as chromatic passing tone. Like, oh, I've got this, I can get to this, oh, let me just fill it in with a passing tone, right? It doesn't always work that way, because the main difference about Baroque music, the reason why we allow for so much chromaticism in Baroque music that we didn't allow for in the Renaissance time period and style, is because of the fact that in Baroque music we now have all of these tonal harmonic progressions that have such gravitas and force and logic to them, and we hear the implication. So if you write something that sort of makes sense on a passing tone level, like, oh, I can use a passing tone to fill it in, and a simplistic, superficial understanding of passing tones, but it doesn't make harmonic sense under the surface level, it's not actually implying a clear logical tonal progression the way that in this period progression sound, you want to try and avoid it. So I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I think it's very important to understand, to be able, if you're writing legitimate Baroque counterpoint, to be able to back up everything that you're writing with what is it implying harmonically. Okay. Okay. So that's the first thing. Another important feature of Baroque counterpoint that wasn't possible in the Renaissance is the fact that you can actually have 2 dissonances in a row as long as one of them is accented and one of them is unaccented. So, for example, I could have, something like, well, this is an example of multiple accented dissonances in a row, but I could have something like this. Something like this. Right. So I've got a 7th, right, a dissonance, which resolves, right, one of the dissonant voice moves by step, right, stepwise resolution is the best. There are only certain types of intervals that can resolve by leap, right, we get a stepwise resolution to an imperfect consonant. It's really nice, right. If we're dealing with 3-part counterpoint, this can be resolved to any type of consonants, like a perfect consonant is fine. But again, you want to try and avoid, if you want your counterpoint to be invertible, you want to try and avoid treating relying on a 5th as a consonance, because remember, it inverts to a 4th, which is considered a dissonance in 2-part counterpoint. But in any case, in 2-part counterpoint, it's very important to try and resolve these things to a 6th or to a 3rd. So we do, this resolves to a 6th, right? And then we can actually leap to a dissonance, and the dissonance does not have to resolve downward. Normally, if you leap to a dissonance, the voice that leapt, right, one moves by step and the other one leaps, right? So that's the first part. One has to be by step and the other one has to be by leap. But the voice that leaps has to resolve downward, right? In Renaissance music, this was what had to have happened. But in the Baroque counterpoint, because we have these tonal, these harmonic progressions that are sort of controlling everything, you can actually leap to a dissonance, and the note that leapt, at some point it has to go down, right? So you could have something like, something like this. You could even have something like this, right? So this seems to be a very dissonant progression, right? But what happens is on the horizontal level, this leap up is resolved downward, and all these dissonances are resolved properly, right? We have a 7th, which resolves to a 6th, another 7th, which resolves to a 6th, right? And then we have a 4th, which resolves to a 3rd, right? So So, sorry. Something like that, right? So this is quite a bit of dissonance in a row, but again, it works. It works in Baroque style harmony, so something to be aware of contrapuntally, because I don't think I went over that in my previous counterpoint video. So you just want to make sure that your dissonances are resolved, and you want to make sure that if the dissonances are chromatic, you generally want to try and make them imply some sort of secondary dominant chord, right? And sometimes that means using a flat, right? So if I'm doing something like, let's something like a, and I'm trying to write counterpoint against it, let's see, something like this, right? So we think, okay, this is a C major, right? Okay. And then this is, a 5 chord, right? And then you can go from some type of 5 chord to another type of 5 chord. That's not a retrogression because they're both dominant function. But in any case, we look at this, we got this tritone, right? So what does this tritone imply, right? And we kind of think this through, and we figure out that it actually is basically just a C dominant 7th chord, the upper structure of a C dominant 7th chord, in which case the B flat needs to resolve down to A, and the E needs to resolve up to F, right? So in this case, it's perfectly okay for this chromatic tone to resolve down instead of up. So you just need to think about what is the chromatic tone implying, and then that will tell you how it's supposed to resolve, right? And that sounds fine, right? Sounds like something you'd hear at a Bach fugue, okay? Another thing to consider is that, let's say you have, some type of counterpoint at the 2-part level, and you want to add a 3rd part, right? It's important to realize, and this is something that was hard for me, who kind of started with 4-part writing, to get used to, is that, you don't always need to fill in the extra notes. So we look at this and we say, okay, what is this, I'll make it a bit more clear, a bit clearer. We can take a sonority like this. We can think, okay, what chord is this trying to imply, right? And of course, you think it could either be, if we're in the key of C major, it could be C, or it could be E minor, right? It could be either of those. So I want to fill in underneath either a C or a B, right? Either one of those are okay. But what if our melody doesn't want to arrive at a C or a B, right? The bottom line is you don't have to have a complete chord every single solitary sonority if your melody doesn't want to do it, right? So it's okay to have this E doubled, right? It's okay to have this G doubled, right? If you end up on a doubled note, it's very important that they escape by contrary motion. So a sonority like this would very commonly resolve like this, right? The E, one of the octaves goes up, and the other note goes down. And that's another important thing to realize in the voice exchange, is that whenever you arrive at a unison or octave, it's usually best in this style that it contracts by step, or what's the opposite of contract? Expands by step, right? Because you're always going to arrive at an imperfect consonance, and that's basically the idea of a filled-in voice exchange, right? So if I contract this octave, we get a 6th, and if I expand the octave, we get a 3rd, right? And that's why you can start with a 3rd, and then go through a voice exchange to invert to a 6th, right? Or the other way around. We can start with the 6th and go outward to get the 3rd, right? And this octave is totally cool. One, because it's usually on a weak beat, which is nice. We want to try and avoid having too many perfect consonances on strong beats. And the other thing is that, we've got stepwise motion in both voices. It's contrary stepwise motion, so it's optimal. And we're not creating any parallels. Because the moment you land on a perfect consonance in this style, you're like, crap, I got to be careful, because you might get parallels, okay? So that's something to be aware of. It's very, very common, happens all the time, to have sonorities like this, where you have a 3rd doubled. One of the notes are doubled, and you've got parallel imperfect consonants like 3rd or 6th, and then the other voice moves down, and so the octave contracts outward, right? If we were to double the G instead of the E, you'd get the same thing, right? The G would expand to this 3rd, right? And then you'd get the F up on top, right? So the end result is that you get this parallel 6th, right? And then this unison G, which you want to be careful about avoiding parallels. It splits out, right? And then you could even take this G, and you could continue the pattern right? Right, so this is nice. Right, that's totally okay, right? And you've got nice stepwise motion, you've avoided parallels, and it's all one-to-one counterpoint, right? So I hope all that makes sense. And again, these are all really important because they happen all the time. I wouldn't bring them up if they aren't like the bread and butter of writing counterpoint, and it'll become more relevant once we actually start writing. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start writing our fugue subject. So because we're already 30 minutes into this video, I'm probably just going to write the subject, and then we'll write the counter subject and the third counter line and the climax, like we talked about planning out ahead of time in the next video. Okay, so let's see. You know what? Let's go with E minor. I haven't written a fugue in E minor, and it's not too difficult of a key to have an easy grasp on. We'll just go with 4/4 because it's easy. All right. So the first thing I want to think about when creating a subject, if you are planning on having your subject work with itself in canon, that's kind of the first thing you need to work out, because in my personal opinion, writing canons are probably the most difficult thing you can do musically. To write a good canon, that's really hard. There are just not very many things that sound melodious and interesting and don't just sound like you're just sort of like, da 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 ba di da ba dum bo. Right? That's cheating to me. Like, there are all kinds of famous row 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 your boat gently down the stream. Very similar melodies, interestingly, but if you just spell out a one chord, right? It's like, okay, yeah, of course, if you write a melody that just 1 1 1 1 1 1 1. Then of course it's going to work with itself in canon because there's no harmonic movement. What's really interesting and difficult, and what Bach was unbelievably brilliant at, was creating canons like his crab canon, that where you have this type of function change, right? So one of the things that I love about the way that Bach writes his canons, which he does all the time, is this little trick where he uses this as a pivot point, right? This note can be used in the construction of a one chord, and it also can be used in the construction of a four chord, right? One is a tonic, the other one is a predominant, right? 4 is a predominant in E minor. And the other thing to realize is that you can also have this E, if it resolves properly, function as a 4/3 suspension in a 5 chord, right? You could have something like this, right? Right, so he was very clever and often had a canon that started on scale degree 1 or used some aspect of scale degree 1, and as you move through the canon and it works with itself, that note, which functioned as a part of the one chord, when it reiterates itself in another voice, it now functions as the fifth of a 4 chord, or the 4/3 of a 5 chord. So there are lots of little clever things you can do like that when you're writing something that works canonically. So we'll try and implement that. I want to make this fugue subject rhythmically memorable. So another thing that Bach does a lot. And again, because we're starting off with writing a Baroque fugue, you really cannot ignore Bach. So that's why I'm recoursing so much to his style. But as we get on later, we'll say things like, this is what Hindemith did, or what Barber did. But in any case, one thing that he often did, Bach doesn't use a lot of oblique motion, right? Oblique motion is where one voice rearticulates itself and the other one moves, especially articulated oblique motion, because there are two types of oblique motion, right? There's articulated and non-articulated, right? Articulated is where both the notes are played, right? You actually hear this note rearticulated, right, as it's played, right? And then non-articulated oblique motion is like this, where one actually stays the same and maintains itself rhythmically, right? And there are also considerations to be made about the type of instrument that you're playing. For example, a piano, if you have really slow, non-articulated oblique motion, you don't even hear the sonority, the E, because it just fades away. Whereas if you were writing for a string quartet or a wind instrument, they could, of course, maintain that sound. So those are some other considerations to be made, but we won't worry too much about that now. But anyway, it's very important to realize that Bach doesn't use a lot of articulated oblique motion in his counterpoint. There's a lot of stepwise motion, there's contrary motion, there are parallel thirds and sixths, but there's not a lot of this. So one thing that he commonly does to help his fugue subject stand out is his fugue subject has a repeated note. One example is the G minor fugue. So whenever you hear that voice coming in, when you hear that repeated note, because it's different from all the counter lines around it, which again doesn't use a lot of oblique motion, it helps it stand out. So we'll model that. So we'll try something like this. This works nice. And actually, this wow, that was easy. This works with itself quite well in Canon. I'll show you that. We'll do it down here. At 2 levels, it works with itself at a quarter note level and half note level. That's funny. I didn't plan that. Usually, it's hard to do this. So. Wow, that's novel. I'll go ahead and play this. That works perfectly with itself. I promise you I didn't plan that. So we've got a third here. This is normally something that you'd have to splay out, right? You know what I mean? So I would basically, if I were writing a canon from scratch, I would write something and then I would immediately splay it out. Excuse me, sorry. And then I would write counterpoint against it, right? So you write the tune, and every time you write a note, you sort of project its shadow onto the intervallic structure underneath it, and then you write counterpoint against itself. That's the easiest way to get that to work. But this just happened to work out quite nicely. So let's go over this intervallically. Okay, we have a third, we have a fourth, which resolves by oblique motion to a third, which is nice. We have another third, right? We have a fifth, right? It is a direct fifth, but it's okay because one of the voices is moving by step, right? So if we want to be, pedantic about it, it's still fine. The fifth turns into a dissonant fourth, which then resolves, kind of implying a 4-3 suspension, right? This one moves down. We've got a lot of nice independence in this measure. So we've got a third here, which turns into a sixth, which turns into a fifth. And this is going to work invertibly because this fifth, I can tell it's going to resolve down. Like a passing tone, so it's treated as if it is a dissonance, right? Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So let's continue splaying this out and see how it works. So I think I'm going to go back here, right? And when you're dealing with something as strict as canon, I think I'm okay with having, because this one is arrived at by oblique motion in the sense that there's this tie. So we really only need to count these. So after these 3 parallel imperfect consonances, I definitely want to move out in contrary motion so we don't lose the independence. But I think I'm okay with this, and I think it'll sound nice. That's really nice. All right, now I'm going to think about this. So this is a perfect example, actually. I don't want to do something like this, right? Because if we look at how this resolves, what does this tritone imply, right? you know, if we do our little analysis here, right? If we have an F sharp and a C in the key of E minor, it's basically 5 of it's a D dominant 7th chord, right? In which case the C goes down and the F sharp goes up, right? So we could do something like this, I suppose. But the problem with that is that I don't want so many 8th notes in a row, because if you just have 8th note against 8th note, we lose a lot of independence, right? And I can't hold this still, because if this F sharp is still, we're going from a augmented interval, an augmented 4th, which needs to be resolved properly. We don't get this resolution that we want, and it goes to a 5th, right? Which has a Phrygian kind of sound, right? And that just sounds out of place in the Baroque style. So this is kind of interesting. We might need to change this. I think we could just stand with that. We also don't have to canonize the entire subject. I mean, this is quite a large, the vast majority of the subject has been canonized, so you can sort of like transition from exact imitation into kind of free counterpoint. And I think that's probably what's going to happen here. So what does this want to do? That's kind of cheesy, but I like it. That's kind of nice. You know, have this nice kind of. So let's think about this. Right, remember when we take a imperfect constants and we contract or expand it, we get well, if we have a 6th and we contract it, we get an octave. And if we have a 3rd, if we have a 6th and we expand it, we get an octave. And if we have a 3rd, we contract it, we have we get an octave, right? So that's what I was thinking about here. And then this line can stay here, right? So we arrive at a perfect consonance. That's okay, right? Now we've got a dissonant passing tone, which resolves by step to this F sharp here, which is nice, right? Because in the long run, the main notes of this perfectly spell out the 5 of 3, right? We're thinking of a D chord, right? A D dominant 7th chord. It's not a 7th in this case, but 5 of G major, right? So D major going to G major, that works out nicely, and we get all the notes of the D major chord. We get A, we get D, we get F sharp, right? This A is double, but immediately it turns into a imperfect consonance, right? Because the moment you have an octave, you want to straight away get to an imperfect consonance, especially in a 2-part context, right? So now let's listen to this lower line and hear what it wants to do. It wants to go back up, which happens to work contrapuntally, which is really nice, right? We got the 6th, and remember, we fill in the passing tone, contracts to a 3rd, just like we were talking about at the beginning. We can do that. Right, we've got a nice little suspension here. This A is suspended against the B, and then it resolves down. And we can get something like this, right? Where we have basically a kind of voice exchange. We have the G and the B, which swaps, and now we have the G and the B, and we've got this nice little dissonant passing tone. So I don't want to keep on going too far because for the sake of getting the subject right, we don't need to keep on writing because we'll do that when we get to the actual course of writing the fugue. So we've written a subject, fairly concise and fairly open, right? It seems like the question without the answer, which is I think good. And we know it works with itself in canon for quite a long ways, which is a great, very useful tool for the fugue. Right, that's nice. It's catchy. Right. And it has this nice little repeated note, yum, da da dum dum dum. So now we got to think about the subject and think about whether or not we can submit it to various kinds of developments. Okay, so one thing, yeah, that actually worked very well. One thing that we can do, and I, just to let you know, in my workflow when I'm writing a fugue, I often like to have a sketch like this is, right? I'll test it. Does it work with canon? Cool. Let me try it. And you just sort of like splay out a bunch of different developments, and then it's just sort of like a sandbox, and then you go and write your actual fugue in a separate file. That's the piece, the finished piece, and you can sort of grab little bits and pieces from the sandbox to build it, rather than just, again, sort of winging it. That's how I like to work, personally. I mean, Bach could improvise fugues, so, you know, he doesn't need to wing it. Can wing it, and it sounds amazing. But in any case, yeah, so one thing that immediately occurs to me is I can start on the same scale degree 1 and go and invert the subject with the other. And we can make a nice sequence with it, right? So fifth sequences are very common in Baroque fugues. And we can fudge this a little bit, because what we want to get to is this. You know. Right, we can write a nice counterpoint against that, but we have to make this. I mean, that's okay, but that leap to me is a little bit awkward. It's like, yep, da da dum 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 dum, boo da da deep be da da. You know, it's a bit contrived. So I think I'm gonna. Since we have a weight here, we have a dotted quarter, so we have a second to kind of prepare ourselves for the leap. So the leap, you know, it's harder to leap in a quicker rhythm, and this leads nice stepwise into the next part of the sequence, and we still get the rhythmic and vaguely intervallic sense, right? Because you still have the stepwise motion. The only thing that's different is that we have a leap instead of a step as before. Right. And again, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be exact. We can take this development and kind of make it a little bit less, you know, sort of like monkey see, monkey do, and maybe change this to a B. Right? So I'm going to put the G here because that's what actually is there, and then I'm going to leave the B, and I'm going to put it as an Ossia note. Just in case that's there. So I'm going to call this Inversion. Right, works nice. Canon. It's turning out to be quite a promising fugue subject, and I'm just curious. I think this will work in with itself in augmentation, at least for a certain bit. I can't believe how I promise you it's not this easy. I just happened upon a really good fugue subject. Yeah, it works with itself. So in augmentation. So augmentation, in case you didn't know, is where you take a melody and you make all of the rhythmic values twice as long, right? So quarter note becomes half note, eighth note becomes quarter note. There's a plugin to do that. Yeah, double. It has to open up another. Yeah. That's funny. We'll see how far that works. It doesn't work here. Once it gets to here, it kind of fails a little bit, but it actually works. That's funny. That's amazing. So at this point we have to choose what's going to give, right? Because it obviously doesn't work. Rather than letting the subject give, I'm going to give the sense of an augmented subject, but then I'm going to change it contrapuntally. So you hear it and you're like, oh, it's the augmented subject, and then it sort of changes, right? So I think it's a bit cheeky, so we'll go with that. So at this point I'm just writing counterpoint, right? Again, to think about this intervallically, I should be explaining this. Octave, right? Passing tone, dissonant, turns into a third by oblique motion. It's rearticulated oblique motion, but it's still oblique motion. Parallel third, parallel third. That's amazing how that worked out. Sixth, nice, right? Fifth, right? But the fifth is treated, the fifth resolves, we have a fifth and then a fourth, which turns into a third. So if we inverted this, this would be the fourth, and this would be the fifth, right? So the fourth resolves to a fifth, and the fifth resolves to a fourth. So whenever you have a fourth and fifth back to back, you know that it's going to work upside down, because if the fourth goes to a fifth, then that's fine, it's going to a consonance. And if the fifth goes to a fourth, the fourth has to resolve to a consonant, which in this case it does, right? We do end up at this. Let me just show this because I feel like it'd be so much clearer. I'm just going to project this voice up, right? Third, sixth, fifth, fourth, third, right? And now let's invert this. Okay, so we've just inverted it contrapuntally. Now we have a sixth, a third, a fourth, right? But the fourth resolves by oblique motion to a fifth, right? And then it turns into a sixth, right? So does that make sense? How that inverts? Basically, just treat fifths as if they're fourths, and you're good with invertible counterpoint, right? And again, we don't have to worry about fourths being a dissonance if there's a third to sweeten it up. So sometimes you can create a contrapuntal texture, and as long as all three lines are happening simultaneously, you can have a fourth. That's totally okay as long as it's treated properly. But if you want to have two-part counterpoint, which often happens in fugues, even if you have a three-part fugue, you'll very often have two voices kind of be in two-part for a second, and then these voices are in two-part, and then all three come together. So, I think it's generally a good idea. It's less limiting. You give yourself more freedom as a composer if you just make everything work at the two-part invertible level. Anyway, so let's put this back. So hopefully all that makes sense. And feel free to ask me questions in the comments if it doesn't. Right, fourth resolves to a third, right? Third, third, voice exchange, right? And this was the point where I was going to get it to work differently. I'm just going to write counterpoint against this real quick. I'm going to use this chromatic tone. So I'm going to fudge it a little bit. I think this will be nice. But if we have this C sharp and this G, right, what's that spelling? What dominant seventh chord is that a part of? A dominant seventh, which has to resolve to D, right? So it's basically 5 of the relative major V minor. The relative major V minor is G, right, really closely related. What's the dominant of G? D. What's the dominant of D? A, right? So if we build an A dominant seventh chord, A, C sharp, E, G, right? The C sharp is the leading tone, and the G is the seventh, which needs to resolve down. So we need to change it to this, and as far as I'm concerned, changing this note works perfectly fine, right? Because we have a leap which resolves back down by step, and it's another chord tone. So it's a slight change to the subject, but those types of slight changes are totally okay as long as it sounds good and as long as you retain the character of the subject, right? It's very, very close to. Right, it's almost undiscernible, the difference, right? And now this works, right? This is another example of what I told you we run into these. Voice exchange, right? Sixth, right? Contracting, It's a way to get in 1-to-1 counterpoint from a sixth to a third. You use this chromatic passing tone. It resolves properly. Nice. I think we'll just keep it as a half note, keep it nice and simple, right? It's a lot of motion in one direction, but it all works because it's stepwise. Try to make the rhythm somewhat different here, you know. And this is generally a good rule of thumb, I think. If you have, and I talked about this before, if you have the same rhythms, you have to make it contrary motion. Otherwise, they're going to sound like the same melody. And the same is sort of true in reverse. If you have the same intervals, you know, then you want to try and make the motion as contrary as possible, if that makes sense. In other words, like, you want to achieve independence. There are two ways of achieving independence. One is by contrary motion, and the other is by rhythmic independence, right? So if you have similar motion or parallel motion, you want to try and make the rhythms as independent as possible, because you're not going to get the independence from the motion, so you have to get the independence from the rhythm, and vice versa. Okay, so because this is completely contrary motion, these lines still maintain their independence, even though for, you know, 3/4 of a bar they have the same rhythm. Yep. We could get really dissonant and do this. Technically, this does work. We have to resolve this up. Can make this interesting. May or may not use this, but I just want to explain how this all works contrapuntally. Right, so we know how all this works. We arrive at a sixth, sorry, excuse me, a third and a sixth, dissonant passing tone, right? And when you have a dissonant passing tone, in this case, because this is the consonant note, and then this lower voice turns into the dissonant note, as long as the note resolves where it would have been consonant with the previous note, it's okay that the upper voice moves to a dissonant note. Okay, so we get this, right? And here, and then we're going even further. This is getting a little bit complicated. Counterpoint is complicated. We're going a little bit further here, and we say, okay, we got the C, we've got the F sharp, right? So how are we going to deal with that, right? C, F sharp, okay, it's a part of a D dominant 7th chord. Needs to resolve to G. F sharp goes, there's a leading tone, you know, T do. F sharp goes up to G. The C is the 7th, goes down to B, right? But we don't get that immediately, right? Right? We get a different note. We get A, right? The reason that this works, and is actually quite common in the Baroque period, the reason that we can leap away from this dissonance is twofold. One, the note that we leap to belongs to the chord that the previous sonority was implying. In other words, with this F sharp and C, we were implying a D dominant 7th chord. What are the members of that chord? D, F sharp, A, C, right? So we're leaping to the note A, which is really just another member of that chord. And we do end up on the G and the B, right? So we do get what we wanted. The tritone is resolved. It just takes us a second to get there. And how does it end up resolving? By parallel thirds, which is nice. So this is a common thing that happens. And it sounds nice. It sounds like you hear it all the time, right? But this is where, again, you know, the subtleties, I think the counterpoint books try too hard to, like, set up rules. And then you're like, okay, cool, I've got these rules. And then they're like, oh, wait, no, sorry. There are, like, 4 billion exceptions to those rules, right? And you're like, well, crap, how am I supposed to remember all this crap? And the idea is just to know very clearly what harmony you're implying. And when you see Bach, quote unquote, breaking a rule or exercising a subtlety in which you can break a rule in the pedagogy, it's very important to understand why. Because if you understand why, then you're freed up as a composer to just sort of compose. And as long as you're logical and everything is harmonically backed up and intervallic, you can sort of just compose and everything is going to work out. Rather than just sort of like having all these rules and bullet points and just trying to be all mathematical about it, because then you're just going to be miserable and you're not going to be able to write a piece of music that sounds natural, right? And then it goes even further. So we've got this G, right, which is nice, right? And then we've got a fourth, right? And we think the fourth is going to resolve down either back up to a G or to an E, right, to a fifth. But no, it goes to a tritone, right? And then this is quite interesting. We think about this tritone, right? And again, let's do like we've been doing this entire time. Let's figure out what dominant seventh chord is. Part we have an F, we have a B, right? Okay, so it's got to be a part of a G dominant seventh chord. G, B, D, F. B is the leading tone, resolves up, and F is the seventh, and it resolves down, right? And you can probably see where I'm going with this. But so what do we get here? The leading tone resolves up, but this note doesn't resolve down. So what are we getting here? We do get some sort of resolution. It seems like a Lydian resolution on a micro scale, right? We get this B that goes up to C, and so we get a perfect fifth, and then it turns into a sixth, right? And then it goes back down to the tritone, and because it goes back down to the tritone, and we do end up with a resolution. It's sort of a more complicated version of what we had earlier, right? We end up getting the resolution that we want. T goes up to do, we just add some embellishment in the meantime. And even if we did this, right, where we didn't get the leading tone, going to C, it's the same thing that happened before, right? This D is another member of the G dominant seventh chord, and then the C is just the passing tone. So if we do this is really exactly what we had a second ago. Literally, it is a contrapuntal inversion of this case right here, right? The only difference is that we've added a passing tone, right? And we went back to the B, rather than maintaining the imperfect consonants and then resolving it. I know this is complicated, but it's very important to understand. And it all works because there's this underlying harmonic progression, right? That is guiding all of it. I'll just go ahead and play that. Yeah, do you see how nice that sounds? And there's so much under the surface. Nice. We could soften this even a little bit. Because if it's just right, it's a bit kind of contrived as a melody. So I kind of like that better. Right. I actually kind of just want to repeat that note. Yeah, I like that. All right. So hopefully that makes sense how all that works. So now I think we're in quite good shape. We have a nice fugue subject. We can invert it and make a sequence out of the inversion. It works with itself in canon for quite a long period of time at the half note interval. And it also works with itself in a sort of fudged augmented canon. So we've got a lot of material to work with, and so I think now that we know that our subject is sort of like, it's a very versatile subject, we're going to take it and we're going to try and write counterpoint against it, right? And I think because we know this subject is so versatile, we're probably not going to change it, but we are going to write the second and third voice in such a way that we can sort of weave them together. So in the next episode, that's what we're going to arrive at, is this climactic moment where we have the subject, a counter subject or counter line. I probably will use a counter subject that recurs just to show how to deal with that. And then the third line in the next video, and then of course the video after that video we'll get into the development section of the fugue, which will be super fun. So I know this was complicated, and I may not have explained. I know some of my explanations may have been a little bit confusing. This is really subtle and complicated stuff, and it's hard to, I'm boiling down in an hour. Like again, like chapters have been written. Like this is kind of a side thing, but there's a book, an analysis of 48 Bach fugues, and there was one where Bach broke some rule or something, and it was a bar of music, a bar of 3-part counterpoint, and this guy. I can't remember the name of the author of the book. I'll probably put the link in the description if I can remember. But he wrote like 18 pages about this one bar, excusing it, why it broke the rules, and why it, and the harmonic implication, and and music theorists are like that too. It's like the Tristan chord from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. It's just a half diminished chord, but contextually it doesn't resolve like it. Books have been written on that one chord, and so it's interesting how you can get all analytical about it, and I think getting analytical is important, but it's, at least for me personally, get analytical only in the sense that it frees you up. You don't want to be bogged down by all these theoretical possibilities. You want whatever conclusion you come to be something that makes sense, and not only does it make sense intellectually in terms of like the math makes sense and the logical definitions that you've presented and presupposed, B follows from A, but you also want to make sure that when you apply that logic to your compositions, it makes your music sound better, right? If you apply logic, I won't even make a 12-tone serialism joke, but it's in the air. If you apply logic that just makes sheer logical sense, and without regard to how it sounds, it's not really going to help you write better music, and you're just sort of following rules for the sake of following rules. So, but I digress. I hope that was helpful a little bit. Again, if any part of this, and you have all the bar numbers written down, so if any part of this doesn't make sense at all, or an explanation I made was unclear, please let me know in the comments, and I'll try to explain as best as I can. And let me know your suggestions, like once we get into the development of the fugue, if you want to try and, if you have any suggestions for how the composition should go, absolutely let me know. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next episode.